Situated in the far northwest of the American continent, Alaska is still regarded as its last frontier. It's huge, and at 1.7 billion square kilometers, is by far the largest of the United States, with far more coastline than all the other states combined. In the south, it is a beautiful, wild and rugged land. With vast coastal inlets and glaciers reaching the sea. Inland, the majestic Rocky Mountains reach their highest point and are surrounded by swathes of boreal forest. Somewhat surprisingly, only a third of Alaska sits within the Arctic Circle, unerringly remote, with a scattering of isolated towns providing access to some iconic birding locations. Our journey to Alaska in June 2022 took us initially from Manchester to Iceland, from there on to Seattle, across the frozen landscapes of Greenland, and after an overnight stop, onto our destination at Anchorage. Our accommodation was the Coast Inn, a regular base over the coming weeks. We were meeting up with friends John and Jane Gregory and a Wings Birding group led by Gavin Bieber, along with John Dunn and later Susan Myers. This was their regular Alaska Majesty of the North tour. But first we had a day to explore the local habitats. Across the road from the hotel is Lake Spennard. Its adjacent Lake Hood hosts the world's busiest seaplane base, handling up to 160 flights a day. The constant arrival and departure of planes doesn't seem to affect the local bird life though. Many were remarkably approachable, particularly the breeding pairs of redneck grebes. The North American race is noticeably bulkier and longer billed than the nominate form found in Europe. We also found this immaculate Slavonian grebe. They're known as horned grebe in North America. It was often alongside a male bufflehead. These were much less common in Alaska than expected. American widgeon were much commoner, and small flocks could often be found on the lake during the frequent visits here over the next few weeks. This male and its female partner were seemingly resident, however. Both scaup species were found here. This Drake lesser score shows a typical peak at the rear crown and a restricted black nail at the tip of the bill. The female has a similar build and head shape, with a relatively small, and in this case diffuse, white patch at the base of the bill. The greater scorp were obviously bulkier, the male with a more rounded head shape and with a large black nail on the bill. The female has a larger white base to the bill and a distinct pale patch on the ear coverts. On another of our visits here, a Drake surf scoter had joined a flock of lesser scorp. Some dusky markings on the white head patches, plus the bill coloration, suggest it was probably a second-year bird. Short-billed gulls were regularly over the lakes, probably visiting from nearby colonies. As the lake became busier with seaplanes, we explored generally elsewhere. Finding our first American robins of the trip, a staple of most locations away from the tundra regions. Also a Lincoln sparrow, its song somewhat drowned out by a nearby American robin. A preening and singing white-crowned sparrow. Plus a dark-eyed junco. And most spectacularly, and directly across from the hotel, a magnificent pair of bald eagles. There was no obvious nest to be seen, but they nonetheless seemed well settled. We also hired bikes and cycled to the shoreline at Utqiagvik Park, with views across to the city. A singing and foraging orange-crowned warbler was soon located. Its trilling bursts of song competing with numerous passing trucks. The orange crown was even visible on occasions. Further east, the track passed an area of salt marsh, host to a lone sandhill crane. Interestingly, on another visit here later on the trip, a different individual was present. This looked to be a younger bird, with less red on the forehead. Further along the coast off the Fish Creek estuary, a pair of breeding plumaged Hudsonian godwits were on the rather distant shoreline. Another site visited before meeting up with the group, and a few more times thereafter, was Westchester Lagoon. It's a popular location, mostly bordered by housing and a rail line, with the airport close by, but can be a tranquil spot early mornings, regardless of the raucous short-billed gull colony on the lagoon's island. They seemed as much at home in the trees as on the ground. Short-billed gulls have only recently been split as a separate species from the Eurasian common gull, the North American short-billed being smaller in body and bill size, and with less black in the outer primaries. On our initial visit, a few chicks were visible, bravely venturing from their nests. Returning a few weeks later, many were by then well beyond the chick stage. And some were almost fledged. Arctic terns were also nesting on the island, and they too had chicks. As with the gulls, a visit nearly 3 weeks later found them well grown. When away from fishing and chip duties, the adults would often sit on convenient perches around the lagoon. The island is famous for attracting passage waders that come here to preen and rest, and on one visit included this breeding plumaged short-billed dowitcher. And also in breeding plumage, a welcome Hudsonian godwit. Lesser yellowlegs were more regular visitors. Along with the gulls and waders, plenty of wildfowl loafed on and around the island. The Canada geese here are ostensibly of the parvipes race, sometimes referred to as lesser Canada goose. There were also a few mallard and gadwall. Gadwall are uncommon here, and we only saw them a few times on the trip. Of the two scaup species, greater were generally the commoner. This bathing male showing the typical greenish sheen on the head. Females in breeding plumage are actually duller than in winter, with the white at the base of the bill more obscured, and even the eyes are more faded yellow, presumably to be even less visible when nesting. Lesser scaup were smaller and more lightly built. Amongst them was this interesting second-year male. It still had retained brownish tones on the head, along with a very obvious pale neck collar. It was keen to make its presence felt. There were also American widgeon, here a couple of males with a lesser score, and this female. Green-winged teal preferred a smaller wetland at the west end of the lagoon. They seemed unperturbed by passing runners from the local marathon. The male's white breast stripe is the simplest way to tell them apart from Eurasian teal, whereas the females are virtually identical, although the head pattern is considered to be more striking on the American form. Nevertheless, some authorities still consider both forms to be regional variations of the same species. The eastern end of the lagoon was more secluded. This pair of trumpeter swans usually spent most of their time on a lake across the highway, but thankfully showed well there on one visit. There were also great northern divers here, presumably a pair with a nest hidden somewhere on an island. In America, they're known as common loons. Neither name does justice to such an immaculate bird. And more pairs of redneck grebes. There were numerous breeding pairs, one with a nest on the shore of the main island. They were on eggs during our first visit, but carrying chicks by mid-month. Both parents will carry the young, usually for the first week after hatching. On a final visit a week later, the chicks were substantially larger. Furthermore, the adults were beginning to lose some of their breeding plumage luster, developing duskier markings on the face and duller bill colours. On meeting up with the rest of the bird tour group, we walked a short distance from the hotel to Connor's Bog, an area of mixed coniferous and deciduous woodland. Soon seeing our first myrtle warbler of the trip. This is the white-throated northern and eastern form of yellow-rumped warbler, the name used when lumped with the yellow-throated Audubon's warbler of the west, and other southern forms. There were also older flycatchers. This is another northern and eastern species and called trails flycatcher when lumped with the very similar willow flycatcher. They have different calls though, and this one was to become very familiar over the coming weeks. It was also the site of our first stakeout, a nest hole found by our previous Wings group and home to a nesting pair of American three-toed woodpeckers. Tracks through the woodland led to a shallow lake, where we were greeted by a pair of mating American widgeon. And lesser yellowlegs foraged along the shoreline. Out in the middle of the lake was a nesting platform occupied by a pair of Pacific divers. Another visit a few weeks later revealed the presence of a chick. Given both parents appeared to be feeding it, that suggests it must have been at least 18 days old. Also later in June, vegetation had grown to the extent that a redneck grebe was now nest building. Another location within easy reach of the hotel was Potter Marsh. Being a popular site close to the city, alongside a main highway, and adjacent to a firing range, it has to be one of the noisiest nature reserves around. Nevertheless, it has some great habitat, and the wildlife doesn't seem to mind. Around the car park was a reasonably confiding orange-crowned warbler. A singing dark-eyed junco. These in Alaska are of the slate-coloured subspecies, which breeds across the north and east of the continent. And American robins. From the car park, An excellent boardwalk stretches across the northern part of the marsh. It offered a more open view of the singing orange-crowned warbler, and also of an alder flycatcher, and a western wood pewee. A peaked crown, buffy eye-ring and neat breast streaking confirmed this to be a Lincoln sparrow. Thankfully, one also perched up in full view. Out on more open grassland was this savanna sparrow. Despite being rather nondescript, the races can be very variable. Here in Alaska, they are of one of the continental forms, all of which show a lemon-yellow supercilium. The weak song was just audible above the traffic noise. Having been generally distant, this one decided to come and rest on a boardwalk handrail. One section of the boardwalk led to a lookout over a series of pools, and where there were good numbers of tree swallows. This wasn't just a fine place to feed and preen. Plenty of nest boxes had fostered a healthy breeding population. Although there were also a few violet-green swallows around, the tree swallows were easily distinguished by their steely blue upperparts, with only a slight greenish tinge, only a restricted white crescent on the rump, and white on the face below rather than around the eye. It's possible to tell the sexes apart, the males being brighter across the head and back. The females have browner tones, particularly on the back, and quite obvious on this individual. Some, like the one on top of this post, were completely brown, and given it was too early for juveniles to be fledged, were thought to be second-year immature females. There were very few wildfowl around, but they included this female American widgeon. Waders were thin on the ground too. However, it was here that we saw our only greater yellowlegs of the trip. A pair along the small river that ran through the marsh. The presumed male was a particularly well-marked individual, with extensive barring on the underparts. The rationale behind the bolder, darker markings of breeding plumage makes more sense when they are camouflaged against their typical feeding habitat. The female was a smaller, slighter bird, less well marked, but still showing the classic long and slightly upturned bill. Returning to the car park on our first visit, we came across a male moose. By maintaining a discreet distance, he eventually felt safe enough to browse out in the open. At the south end of the reserve, there were a few pairs of breeding short-billed gulls. Along with a red-necked grebe. It was also a great area to get close to the Arctic terns which were breeding here. The only vantage points, though, were right alongside the highway, so it was usually noisy, but the terns were clearly accustomed to it.